Hello and welcome to the orientation for fiscal year 26 grantees of the Maryland Heritage Areas Program. My name is Ariane Hofstad and I'm the administrator of the program. And I'd like to start by congratulating you on your award and thanking you for the work that you're doing and that you will be doing with your project grant to help preserve, promote, and share a piece of Maryland heritage. We very much appreciate all that you're doing to lift up the wonderful stories of our great state of Maryland. So thank you for that. This orientation is mandatory. It's something that we're asking all grantees to complete. And it's really designed to help you successfully steward the state funds that you're about to receive. I'm joined by three of my colleagues today that are going to help provide all the information that you need to be able to move through the grant process as you receive award, are managing your grant, and any reporting requirements that will be required along the way. Before we get started, we're going to do a brief round of introductions, and then we will move through our program in hopefully less than an hour. That's our goal.
Hi, everyone. I am Martha Waldron. I am an assistant administrator for the Maryland Heritage Area Program, and we'll be working with about 1/3 of you as you move through your projects as your project monitor. We also have a third colleague who's here with us on our Maryland Heritage Areas Program team, Andrew Arvizu. They're not with us today for the orientation, but they will also be a project monitor for a handful of you and working with you through the lifetime of your project. So you may see our names come across your emails, and we are available to be helpful for you throughout your project.
Congratulations, everyone. And let me introduce myself. I am Sabrina Roundtree, one of the assistant grant managers that will be working with you. And basically, the assistant grant managers assist with processing your grant agreements and also, most importantly, processing your grant payments.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Swaim, and like Sabrina, I'm an assistant grants manager here at MHT.
Great. All right. Thank you, everyone, for the introductions. So we will dive right in. As you can see, we have a very full agenda today. We're going to move through our grants manual, grant agreements, project summary sheets, navigating your grant agreement, walk through some other grantee responsibilities, what to do if an amendment is needed, and various other details around submitting reports, payments, and financial documentation, and also any compliance or easement review requirements that may be attached to your project. So we will move through each of these in order, starting with our grants manual. This is just a reminder that we wanted to provide at the top of this orientation session that everything that we're presenting to you here today is also going to be outlined in our grants manual for fiscal year 26 that will be available on our webpage online. So you can use that as a reference in addition to this video, which will also be posted and recorded online as well. So the first thing we wanted to walk through with you is the top 4 steps for getting your grant agreement executed and getting your first payment. We know that is what everyone is most anxious to do. So starting with step number 1, which has already been completed, that's notifying you of your award. That happened in July of 2025, and we are ready to move on to step 2 after award notification, which is us here at the state level verifying project details with all of you, the grantees. This is done through the project summary sheet, which is available online through the grants portal and will be due to us by August 31st, 2025. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's involved in that project summary sheet, but just know that that is the first step and a very important step in getting your grant agreement executed and getting you your first payment. Once we receive those project summary sheets, we use the information in those to start generating your grant agreements, and then those get mailed out to you electronically, and we ask that those be signed electronically and returned to us as quickly as possible. Those typically will start being generated around September, and depending on when you have provided us with your project summary sheet, we will continue processing those all the way through typically January or whatever time frame is needed, depending on your circumstances. But we'd like to get those out the door as quickly as possible starting in September. Once we receive a signed grant agreement, then we can move forward with approving your first payment, which is typically 50% of your award. We approve that here in our office, but ultimately that payment comes from the Maryland Comptroller's office, and it can take on average about 30 days to be processed through their office. So complete that project summary sheet, that generates your grant agreement, get that grant agreement signed when you receive it electronically. Then we, step 4, approve that, and the Maryland Comptroller's office issues your first 50% award payment. We also highly recommend, and we will provide more information on how to do this, but we highly recommend that you sign up for electronic payment with the Comptroller's office. That can help expedite your payments. Next slide. So here's a little bit more about the project summary sheet. Some helpful tips. This will be, again, a form that you access online through your account, the same grants portal that you use to submit your application. We're asking that it be completed by that August 31st deadline. A couple of things to be aware of in the project summary sheet. There will be a checkbox at the top of the form that we ask you to indicate and certify that you've completed this orientation. And in addition, there's going to be a short quiz. I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of our program today. But we're also asking that you indicate that you've completed the quiz as well. In the project summary sheet, you're going to be reviewing and confirming some pieces of key information. First is the name of your organization and the project contact. We want to make sure that we have that correct. Second is the grant and match award amounts. Again, making sure that those are correctly listed in your account and on this form. Verifying the project start and end dates. All fiscal year 26 grants through the Maryland Heritage Areas program will have a July 10th, 2025 start date because that is the date that they were approved. And end dates are typically, the default is you have a 2-year time frame to complete your project. But if you would like to adjust that end date, maybe you're going to be completing your project sooner than that 2-year time frame, then you can let us know that in the project summary sheet, and we can make that adjustment. We do also ask for the name, title, and email of the person authorized to sign your grant agreement. And we'll go into authorized signatories and a little bit more at a future point in the presentation. But we do ask for that person to be indicated in the project summary sheet so we can use that information to populate your grant agreement. And then for capital projects, if your organization owns the property, then we ask you to indicate that on the form. If the project is taking place on property that is not owned by your organization, then we do ask for a property consent letter. A template of the letter is included in our guidelines and can be provided to you electronically. So reach out to us if you can't locate that. We're happy to provide it, but we do need to have verification for capital projects on property ownership and consent. There's also a section in the project summary sheet where you can tell us if there's anything that's changed with your project in terms of the timeline or the budget. If you feel that the scope of work doesn't capture, accurately what you're going to be doing with the project, then talking to us about that early in the process at this point of project summary sheet is highly recommended so that we can make sure that we nail that down and are in agreement on what your approved expenses are for the project. Also in the project summary sheet, there will be a note about any easement or preservation requirements or any special condition requirements. And we will go into those a little bit further in the presentation as well. But they are noted in your project summary sheet and definitely something that's very important for you to pay attention to. Even if you don't have any changes to what is auto-generated or populated in the project summary sheet, which is information that we pull from your grant application, it's still very important that you complete this form. We need that verification that you've completed the orientation. We need you to provide the authorized signatory names, and we need to know that you're ready to proceed with grant agreement. As I said earlier, the sooner you return the project summary sheet, the sooner we can get moving forward with generating your grant agreement and getting you that first payment. So very important first step, project summary sheet. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So a note about the grant agreement that we want everyone to be aware of is that, let me just double check. Sorry, just double checking one thing. With the grant agreement, please know that this is a legal document. And I believe that Caitlin is going to tell us a little bit more about the requirements around that. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you, Ariane. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the legal requirements first. So after you submit your project summary sheet, you'll be receiving your official grant agreement. The grant agreement is a legal contract. So by signing this document, you're agreeing to the terms outlined within it. Please be sure you read this document in its entirety and that you refer to it regularly throughout the course of your project. It's also important that others in your organization are familiar with the contract and the terms outlined within it, particularly those involved in submitting your request for payment and anyone involved in achieving the project timeline and meeting deliverables. As this is a legally binding document, it must be signed by someone who's legally authorized to enter into contracts on behalf of your organization, which I'll discuss more on the next slide. We'll send you the grant agreement via Adobe Sign to request digital signatures, and you don't need any special apps or programs on your computer to sign the agreement. Upon opening the agreement in Adobe Sign, it'll prompt you to complete specific fields, and it will specify where to sign the document. Once you complete your signature, Adobe will automatically send the grant agreement to other parties at the Maryland Department of Planning for additional signatures. You will receive a copy of the final executed agreement from Adobe when all the signatures have been applied. As I mentioned previously, your grant agreement must be signed by someone who's legally authorized to enter into contracts for your organization. And below are some examples of common authorized signatories. If you're unsure who's legally authorized to sign on behalf of your organization, check your bylaws. If it's not clear that the representative has legal authority to sign the agreement on behalf of the grantee, additional documentation will be required. So the State Department of Assessments and Taxation. Your organization must be in good standing with SDAT in order for us to execute your grant agreement or issue any payments. You can check your organization's status anytime online at the link included on this slide. It's a good idea to check the status ahead of submitting your request for payment. If your organization is not in good standing, we cannot process the request for payment and you risk having funds recaptured. If your organization is not in good standing, it's usually an easy fix, but we can't do it for you. It's something that you'll have to address. You may be able to fix it online. And with that, Ariane's going to discuss navigating your grant agreement.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. So we wanted to go over the grant agreement in a little bit more detail. I'm not going to walk you through all of the sections, but wanted to lift up some of the key, most important ones. The grant agreement is 7 pages long, and you can see here on this slide the 7 main sections that are included in it. That's going to have the really pertinent information that you want to make sure to read closely. You should read the entire grant agreement closely. Others in your organization should, but we want to call special attention to these in particular. The grant and project terms lays out some very important aspects of your project that I'm going to go into a little bit more on the next slide. There's also information about the match and project budget for your project, the terms of the agreement in terms of timelines and when reports are due. Again, those easement and preservation requirements that we mentioned a little bit earlier, and we'll go into more detail later. Acknowledgement of the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority support. That is our governing body, MHAA, and it's important to provide acknowledgement of that support for your project. Any notices about communication lists out the project monitor that is assigned to you, and also the grantee contact, verifying that that's correct in your grant agreement is very important. And then executing the grant agreement with electronic signatures and those authorized signatories that Caitlin was just talking about. So on the next slide, we'll see a little bit more about the grant and project terms. The section here that is especially important for you to read closely is the scope of work. This will be outlined in that project summary sheet. That's the first time you'll be seeing it and able to verify it. And then the execution of the final language of that scope of work will be in your grant agreement. And the way that the scope of work is phrased will be 1 to 3 sentence format. The first sentence just gives a general overview of what it is that we are supporting, what the project is aiming to complete. The second sentence talks about the grant and the match approved expenditures, and the formatting of it reads the grant and the match may support, and then it lists out those approved line items in a narrative format or approved expenses. And then a third line will lay out if there are match only items that are going to be included in your budget. And these are items that will be matching the grant, but not using grant funds to pay for those expenses. So again, please review the scope of work carefully. Reach out to us if you have any questions, but once that is executed in your grant agreement, that is what we're basing your expenditures on. And there is the option for amendment. Martha's going to go into that a little bit later in our program, but we want to get the scope of work as accurate as possible at the point of grant agreement execution. The project budget is actually going to read in a very general way. This is not going to list out the line items that you submitted in your application. Those are going to appear in the narrative format in the scope of work that we just went over. The project budget section of your grant agreement is just going to state generally your grant amount, your match amount, and your total project cost. We do encourage grantees to come up with your own way of consistently tracking your grant expenses and your match expenses. It is going to be required that you keep documentation, that you keep track of those expenses. We'll go into the types of documentation that we would suggest that you collect, or the different types that generally are associated with grants later on. But coming up with your own way of tracking is going to be the responsibility of you, the grantee. We are not going to be looking at itemized budgets from this point forward unless it's a special situation related to financial spot check, which Sabrina will talk about later in the program as well. One thing to note with your budget, you do have the flexibility to spend any amount on any approved line item. And those line items, again, are listed in the narrative part of your scope of work. As long as you do not exceed the approved grant and the match amounts. So again, you have the flexibility to move money between your approved line item expenses that are listed in your scope of work without having to check in with us. As long as you stay within the grant match amounts and as long as you stick to the approved scope of work. The other section in your grant agreement that outlines some very important information is the terms of the agreement. And this is where you're going to see when your reports are due. The project start date, as I said, for everyone will be that July 10th, 2025 date, the date that your grant was approved by the Maryland Heritage Area Authority. And then after that, you're going to see a mid-project report and a project end date and a final report due date. And the dates that we have assigned to those for you to submit them to us will be outlined in the grant agreement. I said this earlier, typically we have a 2-year time frame for all grants. So you will see those reports hitting within that 2-year time frame, unless you've indicated to us that you want some adjustments made to that. But this is a typical outline of what you would see in your grant agreement for due dates around mid-project, project end date, and final report due dates. So the other thing in your grant agreement is going to be a section on easement and preservation requirements. Not all of you will have these, and if you do not, it will indicate that in your grant agreement. It will say an easement or preservation agreement is not required for this grant. Some of you will. Martha's going to go into this a little bit later in the program, but all of the grants that are submitted to us for review are also reviewed by our compliance staff here. And if it is determined that an easement or preservation agreement is either required or that you have an existing easement or preservation agreement that's satisfactory or needs modification, that will be indicated in your grant agreement. We'll also indicate in this section if there's any special conditions that are required of your project. These are typically associated with projects that have an archaeological component, but it can be other things as well. And as I said, Martha will go into that a little bit later in our program, but just be aware that this is a section in the grant agreement. So an overview of responsibilities for grantees. Obviously, successfully completing your project and the deliverable, complete the project that you told us that you were going to complete that's outlined in your grant agreement. We realize that sometimes adjustments have to be made. There are unforeseen circumstances. We have a way of working with you on amendments that we'll explain later in the program as well. But completing the project, as your most current scope of work outlines is obviously part of your responsibility and the deliverable that we're expecting. Spending the funds on all the items that are listed in your most current scope of work. Do not spend grant or match on funds outside of the approved scope of work. That is, something that can cause issues in the execution and processing of payments. And we really want everyone to stick very directly to those items in their scope of work. Fulfilling your one-to-one match requirement is a responsibility of the grantee. When you sign your grant agreement, you're indicating that you understand that you are responsible for a one-to-one match. This can be any kind of combination of cash or in kind. We'll go into some examples of that later, but know that making that match requirement is your responsibility. Making sure that you don't spend grant funds on match-only items and not exceeding your approved grant amount. There is a way to capture other project costs that we can go into a little bit more later. but sticking to that budget as outlined. Adhering to your timetable, or, as we said, requesting an amendment if more time is needed. And then acknowledging the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority and your local heritage area on the project deliverables. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment.
So as Ariane said, one of your grantee responsibilities is to acknowledge the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority for supporting your project. We have some language here that we would love for you to include when you are acknowledging this program and the grant that you have received. This information is included in your grant agreement. It's also on our web pages along with a logo for you to include on your materials that you produce as a product of your grant. We also ask that any consultants that you hire abide by this acknowledgement request as well. So if you have someone who is putting together a strategic plan or perhaps a feasibility study, including the MHAA logo and that acknowledgement of support on the finished product, that plan, for example, is required and requested of you. We also would love for you to provide us with some materials that have the acknowledgement of support before you actually produce those materials, ideally 2 weeks in advance of your production date if possible, so that we can review in a timely manner. This includes public events, any materials like brochures, installation of exhibits, etc. And like Ariane mentioned before, we also would love for you to acknowledge your local heritage area by name and logo as well. Here's just a few examples of what MHAA acknowledgement of support looks like. You'll see kind of in these two suggestions that the logo is highlighted. You can see the statement underneath, and this is a good way to acknowledge the program support on your projects. We talked briefly about the ability to amend your project. This includes removing or adding items from your scope of work. It also includes the possibility of extending your report due dates or extending the overall project end date. We have a lot of flexibility with this program to accommodate some of those unforeseen circumstances or changes in your project that you might come across. And amendments are the way to fulfill those changes. We ask, if you have an amendment request, to please contact your project monitor. So that will either be myself, Ariane, or our colleague Andrew, and explain why you need the amendment. A brief justification is perfect, a couple of sentences. We'd love for you to include a new updated timetable and or project scope and some basic information or status about where you are with your project. As state staff, we will take a look at your request and discuss your project with you, and typically are able to grant that extension and either give you more time or amend some of those details in your scope of work if you found that some items have changed, or perhaps someone has paid for, one of those eligible expenses and you no longer need to. That's an example of why an amendment might be needed. So just, I think with amendments, the main piece of advice is be in touch with your project monitor. We'll be able to assess what might be needed, and we really want to work with you to make sure that this project can be completed successfully. I am going to walk through a few items that are not covered by grant funds, and then we'll also talk about that matching requirement. This is important for you to keep in mind as you walk through the lifetime of your project and work on getting it completed, and especially as you are making payments and working through that scope of work and making sure that you're staying on top of what's approved for grant funds and what's approved for your matching contribution. So these are items that are not covered by grant funds, meaning you cannot use the state money that you receive from the MHAA program on these items. So anything that's not listed in your scope of work cannot be paid for with money from the Maryland Heritage Areas program. You also cannot use state funds on alcohol or operating or overhead costs. There's an exemption here for nonprofits who might have a non-capital project. You can use 15% of your grant award towards those indirect costs. And please be in touch with your project monitor about that if you've not already identified that need in your budget upon your application. You also cannot use grant funds for marketing expenses, although these can be used to fulfill your matching requirement. And lastly, again, you cannot use grant funds for overhead or staff salaries that you spend on the project. There is another exception here. If you hire a contractor or are working with a consultant, their time can be used for with grant funds. So if you're hiring someone specifically to work on your project, you can pay for them and their services with grant funds. I also want to talk about the types of match that we allow. We really encourage you to get creative when it comes to fulfilling your matching requirement for the program, and encourage you to really calculate and keep track of that staff and volunteer time for work directly related to the project or work on the project. Other types of match that we encourage you to consider are donated or discounted professional services, donated or discounted professional materials, or just materials in general, staff time from other organizations who may work directly on the project. So if you have a project that you're working on in partnership with another organization, also keep track of the staff time that they're putting into the project. And then, of course, any cash purchases or expenditures that you're fulfilling outside of the grant funds can be used as your match. Anything beyond the grant funds that you receive and that one-to-one match should be labeled as other project costs. And they don't count towards the match, but we urge you to track and report them. It gives us an idea of how much you're actually spending on your project, and is important for us to know. As you track your volunteer time, if your project will have volunteer time and if you're using it to fulfill your matching requirement, the best way to keep track of it is with a log, some type of volunteer log. We encourage you to obviously track the hours, include who, what, when, and for how long. And it's ideal to use some type of spreadsheet or a timesheet. What you'll do then is, once you have the hours that that specific person has worked, is you'll multiply it by the value of volunteer time in Maryland. Right now, that current rate is valued at $35.53 an hour. And once you do that formula, you'll come up with the time that they have spent and the money that is equal to that time that they've volunteered for your project. We do have a form on our webpage in the guidelines and resources section that is a sample volunteer log that you are welcome to use. You're not required to use it. We don't need to see your volunteer forms, but you should definitely keep them on file and keep them active and up to date. And again, if you need guidance or a starting place for a form, there's one available for you to use and adapt for your specific organization on our web pages. We also have a few procurement policies that we'd like for you to be aware of as you're hiring vendors and making payments related to your project. If you are a government organization, please follow your established procedures for procurement. If you are a nonprofit, we encourage you to take a look at your line items, and anything that is between $500 and $10,000, we strongly encourage you to obtain at least 2 written bids. And for anything greater than $10,000, we encourage you to obtain bids from at least 3 vendors. This is really best practice, and we want to encourage you to do this as you're shopping around for vendors related to your project. If you have a need for a sole source procurement, please be in touch with your project monitor. We certainly can make accommodations for that. We understand if you've been working with a very specialized contractor or someone in particular that is already involved with the project. As an example, just be in touch with us and let us know. That is something that we can definitely accommodate under certain circumstances. I also want to mention that if you received a capital grant for $90,000 or more, you're also required to complete a minority business enterprise plan. This will be attached to the last page of your grant agreement, and we can provide more instructions around this. You're essentially signing the plan to say that you will do your best job at working with minority businesses on your project. Ariane talked about your mid and final reports, which are a condition of this grant. You are required to submit a mid-project report and a final report in order to receive payments and to complete and close out your grant with us. We will be moving to a new online grants portal as of August 31st. And once we move to that portal, that is where you'll submit your reports and future grant applications to MHAA and the Maryland Historical Trust if you're working on any applications for MHT. We'll send instructions about this soon, so no need to worry about it now, but be on the lookout for that information related to your reports.
Yay, we get to discuss payments. So let's discuss the schedule of payments. Typically, you will receive 3 payments under your grant within your grant time period. Payments are made approximately 30 days of approval of submission, and you must be in good standing with SDAT to receive payment. So as Caitlin mentioned earlier in this presentation, we encourage you to check your SDAT before you submit your mid or final reports for payment. So to continue with the schedule of payments, your first payment, you will receive 50% of your award up front. So that will occur almost automatically once your grant agreement is signed by everyone and is fully executed. You won't have to do anything else to receive that first payment. We will take the fully executed grant agreement and move forward with sending that first payment request through. You don't have to do anything. But for your second payment request, which is typically 25% of your grant award, that payment is associated with your mid-project report. So when you submit your mid-project report, there's also a request for payment section within that report. You also must have adequate progress of your report. So you will be able to discuss this more with your project monitor, but making sure that at that midpoint that you have made adequate progress with your project. If you are not ready to request funds at your mid-project report time slot, you can request them when you have expended approximately 50% of your total project costs. So again, if you have any questions as far as pausing with not requesting funds for your mid-project report until a later time, questioning if you are at an adequate progress with your project, you can always reach out to your project monitors if you have questions. Your third and final payment, you will be able to receive this once everything is completed with your project. So complete all spending and work on the project before the project end date. submit a satisfactory final report, submit evidence that all deliverables in your scope of work have been completed, and that can include photos of the completed work or photos of the events, copies of reports, etc. And if you are selected for a spot check, submit all required financial documentation. We're going to talk more about the spot checks and those required documentations in future slides. This was touched on earlier in the presentation as well. Direct deposits. We are encouraging all grantees to sign up for direct deposit within the Maryland State Comptroller's Office. This will allow you to not run the risk of having a lost check in the mail. And we have encountered that so many times that we are pushing and hoping that all grantees take the necessary steps to go and sign up for a direct deposit. So this information is here on the slide in the orientation. I also believe it's in the handbook. Please click the link, call the number, sign up for a direct deposit. It will just alleviate any delay in your payments. So we're going to discuss the request for payment form. To receive a payment, you must complete the request for payment form. These forms are located on the second page of your online mid-project report and your final project report. You are not required to report against individual budget line items. Instead, you will provide totals. So the total grant funds expended to date, the total match funds expended to date, and the total other project costs expended to date. Then there's a little check box at the bottom. You will click that, and that is basically saying that what you are submitting is correct and certifying what you're submitting. Your expenditures must align with your approved expenses that are spelled out in your scope of work. So this is what you will see on the second page of your mid-project report or your final report, which is the request for payment form. And as I discussed, the total grant funds expended to date, total match funds expended to date, total other project costs expended to date. You will also be asserting the amount that you're requesting, the name, title of who's requesting it, and the request date. And then that little box at the bottom that's also highlighted is, again, letting us know that you're certifying that this information that you're putting in the request for payment form is correct. So all MHAA grants are required to keep their financial documentations. And so we're going to discuss financial documentations and record retention. You must keep these documentations in your possession for up to 3 years after the final report due date and prepared to provide them upon request. So once your project is completed after the initial 2 years, that's an additional 3 years that you must keep all of your financial documentation. And every grantee is allowed, as I believe Ariane was speaking on, you're allowed to track your expenses the way you and your organization choose to, but we are asking that every grantee not only track them, but make sure that those expenses associated with the listed items in the approved scope of work corresponds with their financial documentation. So you can choose to track it however you would like, but we do ask that you correlate them with your scope of work, so that if we do request those items, it's very easy for us to know that those items associated with the approved scope of work items. So what is financial documentation? So grantees must retain documents of all expenditures, invoices, receipts, contracts, staff time logs, pay stubs, volunteer time logs. Those are all examples that you must keep and maintain the documentation. For standard account best practices, we also encourage you to keep canceled checks and credit card statements. The expenditures must align with your approved scope of work or most recent amended scope of work. And because we have switched everything to our online system and our online portal, we ask that you scan and upload those documentations with your final report if you are selected for that financial spot check. But if you're not selected for that financial spot check, you still must keep these items in your possession so that if there is a point in time in the future that we request them, you will have them. So a few tips with the record keeping. Again, we have to keep reiterating it. Keep records while doing your project. Do not wait until the end. So as those invoices and receipts are coming in and being collected, please pick up a filing system or accounting system, however your organization is tracking your funds. Please store them and not wait until one of us contact you for those documents and you have to go and look for them. That includes daily time sheets for staff and volunteer time, the proof of expenditures that we discussed. And you do this for all expenditures. So that is the grant funds and matching funds. So when we request documentation, financial documentation, we're going to be looking for both funds from the grant and the match. Grantees must keep all material related to the grant for 3 years from the project completion date. So I just want to keep reinforcing this, 3 years after the project completion date. So our financial spot check policy. A portion of grantees in each grant cycle will be randomly selected to submit the required financial documentation along with their final report as part of our spot check policy. So if you are selected, you will be notified around the time of your project end date. So, as it passes. So you will submit your final project report. And at that time, we'll notify you that we will need additional documentation. All of your financial documentation will need to be submitted. And again, we'll notify you if you are randomly selected. And at that point, again, you're required to submit documentations for expenditures for both grant and match. Your project monitor will work with you to identify and request any missing documentation. And if you cannot provide the required financial documentation, you will risk having your grant funds recaptured. However, we will work with you. We will do our best to make sure that we help you along with this process. So we're going to go over what to submit again when you go through a financial spot check. Proof of expenditure documents, invoices, and receipts, what we say that you should be saving as you are progressing through your grant process, your grant program. And then we ask that they are clearly labeled by the approved items listed in your scope of work. For instance, design consultant, printing brochures, etc. So if you have printing brochures as a listed item in your scope of work, you will create basically a folder for printing brochures, and you will include all of the receipts and invoices that align with printing brochures. So that will be, again, any receipt, any invoice, any staff time associated with it will go into that folder. If we add all the invoices and receipts together, they should equal the line items actual expenditure amounts that you put on your request for payment form. Volunteer and staff timesheets and pay stubs should also be submitted, and any printouts from QuickBooks or other accounting software can be submitted as well.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about compliance and easement review. For those of you who have projects that include ground disturbance or historic properties, this is an important part of the orientation for you to pay attention to. All projects that receive funding from the state of Maryland are required to be reviewed and assessed for the effects of the project on National Register or National Register eligible historic properties. This is a federal and state law that we have to comply with. The compliance team at the Maryland Historical Trust, our colleagues at MHT, have already reviewed your project as described in your application. And when they did this review, they were looking at identifying potential historic properties that could be impacted by your project. They were also assessing the project's effect on those historic properties, including archaeological impacts. And they are looking for ways to mitigate or avoid or minimize those effects if they are present. If the compliance staff at the Maryland Historical Trust determines that anything is required for your project, these are called easement and preservation requirements. You'll see this phrase in your grant agreement. You'll also see this phrase in your project summary sheet when you are awarded, you receive that project summary sheet, and you'll be able to take a look at your scope of work and any easement or preservation requirements that are required for your grant. In most cases, you're not permitted to start your project until these requirements have been satisfied. So please pay attention to them now so you don't have to make changes or, go back on any work that you've already done at a later date. Pay attention to these requirements once you get your project summary sheet, and pay attention again when you receive your grant agreement to sign. If you start work on your project without some of these approvals in place, you risk forfeiting your grant. So it's very important that you're aware of these and pay close attention. If you don't have any easement or preservation requirements, so for example, you open your project summary sheet and you take a look at your grant agreement once it's sent to you, and it says that an easement or preservation requirement is not required for this grant. This means that the compliance staff does not need any additional information about your project. You don't have any preservation requirements, and you're okay to proceed with the project. Please keep in mind, though, if your project scope changes, they might need to review those changes at a future date. So if you have a capital project that is restoring a historic property, and at this time there are no preservation requirements, if you include a new aspect of that restoration moving forward and you need to amend your project, that new aspect will likely have to be re-reviewed by the compliance team. So just keep that in mind. If additional information was requested, or if any requirements are listed, don't begin working on your project until the work has been approved by MHT. This is really important. Please contact Dixie Henry. She's the administrator for the Review and Compliance Unit at the Maryland Historical Trust. And if your project includes any archaeological investigations or cemetery work, we want you to contact our state terrestrial archaeologist, Dr. Zach Singer. Their contact information and the details of this will be included in your project summary sheet and your grant agreement. You can't miss it. So please pay close attention. We also have guidance on the review process, how to prepare a submittal, and copies of the project review form, if that's required of you, on the MHT website. And both Dixie and Zach and Carolyn for easements will walk through these requirements with you. So we are here to help and here to assist, and we'll help you get these requirements in order. Some information that might be required, for example, if it's requested of you, it might be a map. The MHT compliance staff might want to see site plans or more robust descriptions of the work. So this is just what you might expect if you're asked to provide additional information on your project. I'm going to talk about preservation easements, which will also be listed under the easement and preservation requirements section. Easements are legal contracts between the property owner and the state of Maryland. They protect against changes to the property and essentially preserve that property for a length of time. The state has a legal authority once the easement is complete to enforce the easement through inspections, review and approval of changes to that property. And if those terms aren't upheld, it's possible that you might have to reverse unapproved work, or there could be other penalties. So it is a contract, it's a legally binding contract if you have a preservation easement, and it's important to be aware of what is required under that contract. If you have an existing MHT preservation easement, or if the easement and preservation requirements section on your project summary sheet says you're required to convey a new easement, this is what you should do. Do not begin work on your project yet until that work has been reviewed and approved by MHT. Carolyn Pfeiffer is the easement administrator at MHT, and she'll be able to help you start that process of seeking review, and if you're required to convey an easement, of beginning that conveyance process. For new easements, which does not happen often, but it is possible, if you're required to convey an easement, you must complete all of those conveyance requirements before you receive your final MHAA payment. So you can work on your project once that approval has been given, but you cannot receive your final payment or close out the grant officially until that conveyance has been completed. If you have a preservation easement on your property, but there are no easement or preservation requirements for this project, then that means that the work proposed in your application doesn't require easement review. But keep in mind, again, if your project scope changes, the easement staff will need to re-review those changes to see if approvals will be needed moving forward. So keep all of that in mind. If you have any questions about this, it is complicated. There's a lot of moving parts and pieces if you have easement and preservation requirements. So please be in touch with us if you have questions. We are happy to point you in the right direction, connect you with the right person at MHT to make sure you understand those requirements that are expected of you.
Great. Thank you, Martha. One quick thing that I just wanted to correct on our previous slide, Carolyn Pfeiffer's name has recently been changed to Carolyn Nozak. So if you see Carolyn Nozak, we are referring to the same person as Carolyn Pfeiffer. So apologies for our slides being slightly outdated, but wanted to note that for everyone. So we are coming to the end of our orientation. Thank you for hanging in there with us. We have, one final thing that we wanted to bring to your attention. We hope that this orientation has provided you with the information that you need to successfully steward the state funds that you're about to receive. We would like to verify and record that you've completed the orientation through a short quiz. It's a quiz that we hope you will find fairly easy, information that perhaps you already knew or you learned during this presentation. We have a link here in this presentation. We will also provide this when we send your project summary sheets. You would have already received it in your notification email when you were notified of your award. So please complete this quiz after completing this orientation. As I said earlier, we'll be asking you to indicate that you did both at the top of your project summary sheet. And it's a way for us to record your participation and completion of collecting all of the information that you need to successfully manage your grant. With that, I wanted to just say a final thank you. Thank you for the very valuable work that you're doing to help lift up the really diverse array of stories that are important to Maryland, important to telling our heritage, all of the historic, cultural, and natural resources that you all are caring for and sharing with the public are ultimately adding to your local communities and really helping to strengthen the state of Maryland. Being able to share these stories, attract visitors, have residents interact in a way that collectively tells all the different aspects of our heritage is valuable and important work. And on behalf of the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority, our governing body, and also the Maryland Heritage Areas Program staff, which is comprised of myself, Andrew, as Martha indicated, unfortunately is unable to be with us today, but Andrew and Martha, we thank you. And know that myself, Andrew, and Martha are one of the 3 project monitors that will be assigned to you. But Caitlin and Sabrina are also support staff that we work with very closely at the Maryland Historical Trust, and we are all available to answer any questions that you have. So please reach out to us. Best of luck with your grants, and thank you for attending this orientation.